Playing with fire, the flame, and the fervor. The early Greeks held a concept that 4 basic elements, air, water, earth, and fire, could be used to explain the nature and complexities of all matter in terms of simpler substances. These ideas were still considered valid in Europe in the Middle Ages. Today's sermon, Playing with Fire, is the 4th in a series of 5 services on the ancient concept of the elements, and we have added an important 5th, love, introduced in a not-so-ancient movie called The Fifth Element. And that concept is at least as valid as the others. In fact, we chant here every Sunday that love is the spirit of this church. I was thinking that these original elements are all related in a way. Fire is connected with things grown from the earth. Fire needs air to exist, and it is usually water that extinguishes fire. But here I go, following the same erroneous pathway that a lot of old Greeks did, as well as medieval scholars, toying with a doctrine of how the earth operates, which has been proven to be an avenue to nowhere. Yet that's probably okay in my view. We don't need to always live in an absolute reality like science professors. We can have fun with fantasy also. We live in the body, and we also live in the imagination. Science is not the only teacher. Speaking of playing with fire, what role has fire played in the lives of humans over the millennia? Forester and author-lecturer Peter Wolleben, in his book, The Heartbeat of Trees, says that fire is the most consequential achievement of humankind. Without blazing flames, our brains would never have developed to the size they are today. Cooking food makes many fruits and meat easier to digest, and this means that meals deliver significant more energy. About 25 years ago, a scientist stood at this pulpit and told us that the ultimate source of life on earth was the sun. I've never gotten over that. And since then, I have spent many hours researching and testing ideas to find out the wherefore and the why of it. Along the way, I have often wondered why, when religions were being developed by early humans, that there were not more sun worshippers. It seems to me that the sun would be a great candidate as a natural deity on which to bestow praises and from which to ask for beneficence through prayer. We feel the sun warm on our faces. We rely on its heat and light to grow our food. Our spirits are stronger, happier, generally on sunny days. So why were there not more sun religions like there were in ancient Egypt or modern Andes mountain societies in India? It's curious. Many societies, there's a whole other story that you could go with that, go down the rabbit hole on that one, I guess. Many societies worship deities of fire, though. The ancient Greeks had Hephaestus, god of fire and metalsmithing, and Prometheus, who stole fire from heaven and gave it to humans. In ancient India, fire was the most sacred object of worship. Agni, the two-headed god of fire, is depicted with flames coming from each of his mouths. In Irish mythology, Bridget was goddess of fire, healing, smiths, poetry, wisdom, and fertility. Quite the responsibilities. This sounds like some of the portfolios of Canadian cabinet ministers. Bridget is associated with ritual fires of purification. Other communities around the world had fire deities and fire myths, sometimes involving fire-breathing dragons. One of my favorite books, read many years ago, is A Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold. It's one of the first books on sustainable environment, written in 1949, and it became an American classic and is still quoted today. The book takes the reader through an entire year on Leopold's farm and woodlot in Wisconsin. The following is from the month of February. There are two spiritual dangers, he says, in not owning a farm. One is the danger of supposing that breakfast comes from the grocery, and the other that heat comes from the furnace. He then describes cutting a dead, mature oak for firewood, while he pondered the ages of the tree rings he was sawing through and what was happening in history during those years. Every surviving oak, he begins, is the product of either rabbit negligence or of rabbit scarcity, as rabbits are known to chew the tender bark of oak seedlings. And he begins to cut. Fragrant little chips of history spewed from the saw cut and accumulated on the snow before each kneeling sawyer. We sense that our saw was biting its way stroke by stroke, decade by decade, into the chronology of a lifetime, written in concentric annual rings of good oak. And Leopold goes on. Now our saw bites into 1929, when stock markets crumpled. If the oak heard them fall, the wood gives no sign. Nor did it heed the legislature's several protestations of love for trees, a national forest and forest crop law in 1927, a great refuge on the upper Mississippi bottomlands in 1924, and a new forest policy in 1921. Nor did it notice the demise of the state's last marten in 1925, nor the arrival of the first starling in 1923. We cut 1906, when the first state forester took office and fires burned 17,000 acres in these sand counties. And he continues on until finally, rest, cries the chief sawyer, and we pause for breath. It is this sunlight that is now being released through the intervention of my axe and saw to warm my shack and my spirit. He concludes with, "These things I ponder as the kettle sings and the good oak burns to red coals on white ashes. Those ashes come spring. I will return to the orchard at the foot of the sandhill. They will come back to me again, perhaps as red apples." Many people today have allergies to smoke, and breathing in wood smoke is definitely not good for your lungs. Yet many others instinctively feel a sense of well-being in front of a campfire. It must be written in our DNA. A similar feeling is elicited by tuning the television to the fireplace channel, where you can watch and hear logs burning and sparking in the fireplace. At my place, we don't have a fire in the hearth very often, and when we do, it is usually on special occasions with family. But I love the whole process of preparing for the fire and the fire itself. It is a very sensual experience for me. I love the scent of the wood, the rough feel of bark, and even the pungent and very sticky sap that inevitably gets on your fingers. I like the sound of it as it thuds to the ground and sparks on the andirons. Here's a sound poem I wrote about that experience. It's called Heartwood. Day's first light, and I am at the block. I swing and chop thick logs. I whack at wood, hack logs with an axe, arc and chop, swing and lop off bark. Bark cracks off, flips and flips, thwacks the shed. I crack oak, whack oak till it splits in chunks and thumps to the ground. I stumble on a lump, bunt the chunk with my boot. I huff and wheeze, puff and breathe in gasps of frost fresh air, exhale minty wisps, breaths of mist. I split logs, chop and chop, hack and whack till, at last, the task is done. I stack chunks of trunk and bark and bump knots of oak, logs clunk. I collect sticks and chips into thick stacks. Soon I spark a match that flares, then sit and sip my tea and listen to the crackle and the hiss of this, my morning's heartwood bliss. Did you know that this Winnipeg church exists today because of a friendly bonfire set outside the building more than 130 years ago? You see, there was a young man named Aaron Bjorn S. Bardal who came to Winnipeg from Iceland in the early 1890s, along with his brother Paul. It had been the custom in Iceland to hold a late church service on New Year's Eve, and then afterward to build a big bonfire outside of the church and wish everybody a Happy New Year at midnight in front of the fire. But the Lutheran Icelandic Church in Winnipeg would have nothing to do with these so-called pagan rituals. So Aaron Born, who was a Lutheran all the same, asked the newly founded Icelandic Unitarian Church if he could light a bonfire in their yard and wish everyone a Happy New Year at midnight as per Icelandic tradition. Bjorn Peterson, the minister, and his wife Jenny McCain Peterson said yes, that would be okay. The Petersons began holding services in Winnipeg when they moved here from Minnesota in 1890, and a year later, in February 1891, they established the first Icelandic Unitarian Church of Winnipeg with 22 charter members. Bjorn and Jenny shared the pulpit and began to grow the church. Unfortunately, Bjorn died in 1893, and Jenny took over the work as minister for most of a year. It was during this time that Aaron Bjorn Bardal and his brother desired to get into the dray business, hauling heavy loads. They needed some startup capital, and they were friends with the Unitarians, so they asked Jenny McCain if they could borrow the princely sum of $200. She loaned the money. The brothers bought a team of horses and a wagon, and they went into business. The enterprise soon morphed into the funeral business, and the Bardal Funeral Home was established on January 1, 1894. The family-owned business is still successful today. But Aaron Bjorn Bardal, who continued to identify as a Lutheran, never forgot the generosity and trust that he received from the early Unitarian Church, which was struggling itself then. Once a year, every year, for decades after, the Unitarian Church of Winnipeg would receive a donation of $200 to $300 from the Bardal Funeral Home as a thank you. I am told that it is those monetary gifts during the lean and depressed 1930s when nobody had any money. It was those gifts that kept this Unitarian Church afloat, and we avoided bankruptcy. My son-in-law, who married a Unitarian Universalist, is of Icelandic descent and is related to that Bardal family. And so is Reverend Stephan, for that matter. Fire plays an important role in our church practices every week. We light a chalice at the beginning of every service and extinguish it while we sing "Carry the Flame" in unison. But what does it mean to carry the flame? Excuse me. Well, to me, the lighting of the chalice is the signal and ritual to indicate that we are now entering a time of centering, an occasion of listening and awareness, and a moment of reflection. The flame is a symbol of the light of understanding, reason, and tolerance that we strive for, of embracing the world with our love and messages of hope and caring. When we sing "Carry the Flame," it calls upon us to carry the sentiments and practices of Unitarian Universalist beliefs into our communities in the upcoming days. It's all about love. These past several years, the forests have been dry and glutted with kindling, the perfect conditions for wildfires. The year 2023 was a record year when it seemed that all of wilderness Canada was burning. Last year, Jasper was in peril, and a third of the town was burned down, as well as huge swaths of forests. I have spent many, many hours hiking the trails in Jasper when I was living in Alberta. A number of years ago, my wife and I witnessed a forest fire in its early stages in the Monashee Mountains from the shores of the Arrow Lakes near Fervour, BC. You could smell the wood smoke in the air as the flames climbed the trees. It was heartbreaking to watch, and you felt like crying, because there was nothing you could do to save those trees. Fortunately, water bombers were on their way. For 70 years, Smokey the Bear has been telling us that only you can prevent forest fires. And this is a good warning to heed. And yet, we humans are also the author of our own enigma. If we go against the eons-old natural pattern of forest fires happening about every 25 years or so in a given area, by trying to prevent any fire from starting, we are then also allowing trees to grow longer and closer together and to create a massive ground cover of kindling and brush, the perfect ingredients for a wildfire. The latest fire science, which also mimics traditional indigenous knowledge about fire, is that prescribed and controlled burns help prevent wildfires and also act as a fire calming influence when wildfires do take off in the wind. Tree guru Peter Wolleben cautions foresters about what to do when forests are beset by fire, or insects or fungus. He writes, "Cutting down trees is the desperate attempt to salvage the wood while it is still worth something. Some of my colleagues in Germany are writing off whole stands of ash and allowing perfectly healthy trees to be harvested. And with that, they are hastening the decline of the species. In every stand, you can find a small percentage of healthy or only mildly infected trees. If you were to leave these more robust trees standing, then they could reproduce and their offspring could create healthy woods again. And yet concerns about revenues combined with the attacks of the aggressive newcomer mean more and more ash are disappearing. Similarly, even in beetle-infected forests and in burnt forests, there are individual trees that have survived and are capable of replanting all by themselves the new, more resilient forests. Recent research has stressed the importance of not cutting down the mother trees, which generally are taller, larger, longer lived, and healthier. These trees are the key to rebuilding a forest. Best of all, the mother trees know how to rebuild a healthy forest best. This is what they have been doing for the past 300 million years. Comparatively, humans have been around for only 300,000 years, and human forest management has existed for just 300 years. Peter Wolleben has stated, "Primeval forests are our most powerful allies in the fight against climate change. And this, it is by no means too late to protect nature. Healthy and abundant forests are the key, so we must use less lumber, less paper, and less packaging and try to prevent wildfires." In September of this year, North America's first wildlife management program is being set up at Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops. It will train 20 students in wildfire science, indigenous fire practices, emergency management, and climate adaptation. In BC and Alberta, AI fire detection programs will be set up with smoke detection cameras to give firefighters early alerts before fires get out of hand. And in beleaguered Jasper, which lost 358 homes and businesses last year, the Federal Parks Department has pledged to speed up the building permits process. In the meantime, Alberta has offered to spend $112 million to build 250 interim homes in the town for displaced residents. First Nations people have always had a special relationship with fire. Ancient Indigenous firekeepers made fire by spinning a bow drill in a small bowl or hearth filled with dry timber. Other First Nations used flint and pyrites. They used fire to keep warm, to boil and cook food, for religious ceremonies, and to set brush afire to form a fire break. Indigenous firekeepers and ecologists in British Columbia today say it is time to restore the ancient practice of lighting careful fires for the purpose of calming wildfires. During the 1970s and 80s, about 100,000 hectares were prescriptively burned each year. But that has fallen to less than 10,000 in recent decades. And the number and severity of wildfires in BC has grown hugely, especially in 2023, a record year for wildfires in Canada. In the past few years, Lytton, BC, and Jasper, Alberta were severely devastated by fires. Among Indigenous people, there is a belief that fire is an earth cleanser, and they use burning brush to fight fire with fire. Joe Gilchrist, an Indigenous firekeeper from Skeechiston Reserve in central BC, says, setting controlled fires helps reduce fuel for wildfires. The ancient First Nations practice of setting prescribed fires to offset possible wildfires, which is still in practice today, rests on an understanding that fire is part of the natural process of life on Earth. It is not an aberration. Science and foresters are now only beginning to understand the difficulties in trying to manage forests, and those management programs have, in most cases, not been successful. In fact, they have contributed to causing worse wildfires because they allow for a massive buildup of kindling. A more comprehensive program must be put in place, a program that involves listening to Indigenous firekeepers, to forest scientists and ecologists, and to the trees themselves. Campfires are a long-standing tradition in this country. Many happy times have been experienced by children and adults around a campfire. The warm glow on people's faces, the marshmallows and hot dogs on a stick, the close sharing of space with family and friends, the stories and songs. And there's still kids that ask, is the NASA camp going to be going this year? Every year we get that question from kids who have been there before. There was a whole duffel bag of songs that we sing in front of a campfire. I remember from childhood my mother and aunt at camp leading us in Little Red Caboose, You Are My Sunshine, She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain. There were rats, big as alley cats, and Do Your Ears Hang Low. We never got tired of those songs. Here's a poem I found on the net that attempts to capture that wonderful experience of the campfire. It's called Embers of Togetherness by Anonymous. Enkindled glow beneath the starlit dome, around the fire where laughter starts to swell. The crackling flames weave tales of love, a poem. In this embrace, our hearts collide and knell. With each bright spark that dances in the night, the shadows sway as friendships come alive, sharing stories wrapped in warmth, pure delight. With every ember, cherished moments thrive. So gather round, dear hearts, and let love flow, for in this fire's glow, our spirits grow. So remember to be careful with fire, but always carry your flame, and be generous with love. Our closing hymn is 1028, The Fire of Commitment.